Yeah.
We're
That place.
kind of gathering here.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things on logistics. If you feel driven for drink or food, you have an unsatiable need. As long as you're quiet, we don't mind you come up and do that. We're gonna do this first panel in which Nolan probably will talk about the issue of really how we tell and what worker stories are in these challenging times. We will break, and then the second panel will be moderated by Jeremy Malloy from the History Department. So that having been said, I am Elizabeth Faue, the Director of Labor Wayne and of the Reuther Center, which is sponsoring this workshop. I want to welcome you to what we hope is the beginning of a conversation about communications and the problems we see in getting out the news about labor and workers and telling the story in what increasingly ought to be called the disinformation age. This workshop is going to be one of a series this year on work, labor, and communication, sponsored by the Reuther Center for Workplace Issues, the Reuther Library, and the Departments of Journalism and Communication in the College of Fine, Performing, and Communication Arts. Affiliated departments across the university are represented here in the audience, along with many affiliated unions and community partners and allies. We will conclude this series in the spring with Stephen Greenhouse coming to give the Miller Lecture, probably in early April. But expect to see some late breaking news about other panels. We have a couple in the works. I just actually have connected with somebody who's publishing a book on Federated Press, a long-term object of my obsession, at least for a few years ago. And I'm hoping to bring her, if not this year, then maybe next year. That's Victoria Grieve at Utah State. But to the moment at hand. Telling Labor's story represents our efforts to assess and address continuing crisis in our country's media, in print, websites, and social media networks, digital or audiovisual media, or broadcast on traditional cable or streaming services. We are surrounded, it seems, by people communicating. So how do we communicate, find or expand our audience, shape what seems to be the shapeless, and also break through to ordinary citizens, workers, and voters? This, by the way, is one of the top issues that unions saw in the last presidential election. We're not getting the news out, and people aren't hearing what you say. So this is a crucial part of moving forward. Speakers for our event today include Hamilton Nolan, writer for In These Times and author of The Hammer, Power, Inequality, and the Struggle for the Soul of Labor. We had no explore near you. Also of How Things Work, Labor Politics, and Power on Substack. Kim Kelly, author of Fight Like Hell, The Untold Story of American Labor. Also to be found in your local bookstore or online. And Fight to Win, Heroes of American Labor, something I just discovered. It's a younger adults version of Fight Like Hell. So she is a freelance journalist and labor activist, published in the New York Times, Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and Vogue. Also, I think he's coming in a little in a bit. Jonathan Kissam, Communications Director for the UE and the News, and author of Domestic Left on Substack. Anne-Marie Strathel, Communications Director of Unite Here, and a union campaign director, historian, and artist. And Dave Elsala, activist, long-term editor of UAW Solidarity magazine, and one of the current producers of Forgotten, The Murder at the Rouge Plant, which will run in Detroit this fall. We have organized today's workshop around two themes. First up are Kim Kelly and Hamilton Nolan, speaking on the stories themselves, with historic and contemporary information and stories about workers. the labor movement and the political moment. After a break, we will have a second panel on how we work to find, expand upon, connect, and communicate the news. The stories about labor and workers, the labor gathering and truth-telling, and the communications and networks from which it is drawn. It will feature Jonathan Kism, and Anne Marie Strassel and Dave Elsla. I moderate the first, Jeremy the second. But I want to stress this. We encourage you who have experiences of your own to join the conversation and Q&A periods that follow the speaker's comments. Kim?
Actually, Hamilton's first.
Hamilton's first.
All right. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Wayne, today. Thank you all for coming today. I've never actually been to this building before, so it feels like an important place in labor history. So I'm really glad I got a chance to be here, and with my friend Kim. So I'll just tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm here today. To start out, as she said, I'm a labor journalist. I grew up in Florida. I had politically activist type parents. My dad was a civil rights worker, and they were communists in Atlanta, and grew up in Florida, hearing those types of stories my whole life. Politically minded type of family. I graduated from school. I was in Florida. I was working at a pizza shop, and I basically had two skills, which were making pizza and writing. And I had to kind of decide which way I wanted my career to go. So I moved to New York, and I went into journalism. I didn't set out to be a labor journalist per se. I just really set out to try to write about the basic questions that we all ask ourselves about, like, why is America fucked up? You know, why do the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Why is there a millionaire in a penthouse and a homeless person on the street? You know, why does money control politics? The sort of basic questions that I think a lot of us think about in terms of why this country has gone off the rails in many ways. And I found over the years, as I reported on those things and wrote about those things and investigated those things, that over and over, I kept being drawn back to labor issues. And the threads of those larger problems kept coming back to issues of labor and issues of worker power and the decline of worker power specifically. So I kind of got drawn into labor reporting like that because I found that it was the thing that sort of sat at the heart of all the biggest issues in this country that I was interested in. So soon enough, I was a labor reporter. In 2008, I went to work for which at one time was a successful online media company, and it was essentially a daily blog. Published a lot of stuff every day, had millions of readers, and it was an interesting format. The rise of online media actually kind of created a lot of new opportunities for labor reporting and labor journalism. You know, I fortunately was not the person who had to get all the traffic for Reuther. You know, people were writing about celebrities and scandals and all that stuff, and they would get all the traffic, and then I could kind of coast and write about labor stuff, you know, and just sort of put my stuff out there in front of the audience. And it turned out to be a really good way to kind of get those stories to a mainstream platform like that. And one thing that we started to do a lot over the years was we would run series where we just have people write in and tell their stories. So I ran a 40-week-long series during the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, and it was all unemployment stories. So people who had become unemployed would write in and tell their stories, and then every week we'd publish a dozen or so of those. And we kept it running for almost a full year. And you know, people found that really meaningful. And we went on to do series with Walmart workers would write in and tell what it's like to work at Walmart, you know, Home Depot workers. We did Target workers. We were, I think, probably the first mainstream place to do a series of Amazon worker stories like that. We had warehouse workers write in and tell their stories. And then we had the tech workers write in. We had the drivers write in and tell their stories. So we published a whole lot of series of worker stories like that. And they're really fascinating, you know, as anybody's read does Turkle knows, like those first person stories from workers, I think were in many ways some of the most important stuff that we published. And, you know, whenever I talk to like journalism students and they say, what do I need to know to be a labor reporter? I'm just like, curiosity is all you need to know, you know, because when it comes down to it, labor journalism is just talking to workers. You know, I mean, you can develop a lot of expertise over the years, and there are labor journalists who are experts in labor law or in unions or in history or a lot of things, but fundamentally, you know, it's just talking to people and being interested in what their stories are. And, you know, I think a lot of the stories that I've written in my career that have had the most impact, unfortunately for my ego, are not the stuff that is full of my brilliant thoughts, you know, but it's like this chance that I had to tell, you know, to kind of turn over the platform to workers to tell their own stories. In 2015, I was still at Gawker, and the Writers Guild of America East, which was traditionally a screenwriters union, decided that they wanted to organize in the digital media space because the traditional media, print media, newspapers and magazines, as many of you know, had been unionized for, you know, 80 years at that time. The newspaper industry has a whole history of vicious labor battles and all that. But as online media was rising up and newspapers were going out of business, frankly, and a lot of those jobs were moving to new media and online media companies, there are really no unions in the online media space. And so Writers Guild decided they want to organize. I had a meeting with the Writers Guild organizer, and I had written some stories about Vice, which is where Kim worked actually, and about how they were a terrible place to work and exploitative employer. And so the organizer met with me and was trying to get some leads to organize Vice. And during the course of the conversation, I said, why don't you try to organize us? We're better than Vice. Why not us? So we decided to try to organize Gawker. Our website we had kind of a culture of radical openness at Gawker. We sort of just put everything out in the open. So when we decided to organize, we published a post on the site and said, we're going to organize a union. Here we are. And over, you know, a few weeks into the campaign, as we came up on the vote, we put up another post and said, you know, if you work here, go in the comment section of the post and say how you're going to vote in the union. And so all, you know, dozens of employees were in there like, I'm going to vote yes or I'm going to vote no, and here's why. And, you know, to us, that was normal. That was how the company operated. I found out later that the professional union organizers were like having heart attacks when we were doing all that. You know? But in retrospect, it was valuable because it was one of the first times that you know, a lot of people had seen that process play out in public. You know, and for years people would ask me to send them those posts because it was sort of a you know, teaching material almost about what a union drive looks like. So we did, in fact, unionize Gawker Media, and we went on to negotiate our first contract. And as soon as we signed our first contract, almost immediately, the company was bankrupted in a lawsuit that was funded by evil Republican billionaire Peter Thiel, who's now one of the most powerful people in America. And the company was sold out of bankruptcy to a big media company. But because we had signed that union contract, none of us got laid off, and none of us had our salaries cut when the company was sold out of bankruptcy. And so we got a tangible demonstration of the value of that union contract very, very fast, you know, at Gawker Media. And also after Gawker unionized, there was a big wave of unionization within the online media space, including Vice, where Kim was. She can tell you about that, and tons of other. At this point, most of the major online media publications are union at this point. And it also sort of grew to include a lot of more traditional media companies as well. A lot of newspapers have unionized in the past decade. New Yorker Magazine, Condé Nast magazines, Hearst magazines, the LA Times unionized, which was you know, an incredibly anti-union paper for 100 years. They blew up the LA Times building 100 years ago because the owner was so anti-union, you know, and they unionized within the past decade. So it's been a very heartening process to watch, you know, the media industry sort of really go into that strong union wave over the past decade or so. And one side effect of, I think, the union wave in the media industry has been a rise in labor reporting because essentially because you've had thousands and thousands of journalists across the country going through union drives in their own workplace and just having the light bulb go on and be like, wow, this stuff is important, you know? And you have seen, I think, over the past decade, a rise in the amount of labor journalism, the breadth of labor journalism, the quality of labor journalism. And I think that's played a part in some of the elevation of the profile of unions in America over that time. But, you know, now our industry is kind of crumbling. We're kind of going the other way. Hundreds and hundreds of the journalists that we unionized in the Writers Guild have been laid off subsequently. And the journalism industry and the media industry at large is very much in a down cycle. The very short reason for that is that big tech companies like Google and Facebook figured out how to suck out all the ad money that used to support media companies. Now that money goes to tech companies. And so it's caused the layoff of thousands and thousands of journalists across the country. And so, you know, as a result of that, I mean, the very short kind of golden boost that labor journalism has had over the past decade is really draining away pretty fast at this point. And most of the good labor journalists across the country are people like me and Kim, who are self-employed, full-time freelance people. And you know, there are some good staff labor journalists left out there, but not a whole lot. I could definitely count them on this many fingers. And many of them are at small outlets that are, you know, politically minded outlets, left outlets, that do great work, you know, but that are always kind of struggling to make it. You know, I can say as somebody who worked for Indies Times Magazine, it's a shoestring operation. So like, you know, the amount of labor journalism is just not what we would wish. And, you know, I can tell you, and Kim can tell you, for every labor story that I write, there's a dozen more stories that I don't write because I don't have time or I don't have the bandwidth that are just as good and just as important, you know. And I really believe that every, you know, union drive is worth covering, every fight with the boss worth covering. All that stuff is newsworthy, but there just is not the bandwidth for it to be covered today. And it's a serious problem. So I hope that one takeaway from this discussion today for all of us is that labor journalism is a part of the labor movement, you know, and it is important and maybe vital. I want to overstate how important we are, but it's very important to have a robust, thriving system of labor journalism to accompany the labor movement itself. And that bump of the past decade is going away, and it's not just going to hurt journalism, it's going to hurt the labor movement itself also. And so I always, whenever I talk at events like this, you know, I say, like, all of us who are part of the labor movement need to think about how we can support labor journalism, because there's a tree falling in the forest effect of not having anybody there to tell the stories. You know, if you go on strike and no reporters cover it, it's a problem. If your boss is illegally firing people and nobody writes about it, it's a problem. It directly undermines leverage for unions. It deprives working people of a chance to get their stories out. And so I always hope that the labor movement will kind of think about making it a priority to support labor journalism itself. Now, I want to pull back a little bit and talk about what I see as kind of the big picture narrative arc of why labor is important. And I don't think I'm going to tell any of you anything that you don't know when I talk about this, but the reason I think this is important is because, you know, one thing I've learned as a labor journalist is, like, if I write a story that says a union does XYZ, 95% of people do not care about it. I mean, people today, we live in an era of low union density. Most people do not have a direct personal connection to unions. Most people do not inherently see why they should be interested in this stuff. So as a labor journalist or as anybody who wants to get these stories out, we always have to think about how to give people a narrative frame to tell them why this stuff is important to the issues they care about, to their own life and stuff like that. So my personal kind of big picture view of like labor and why we should all care about it is mid 1950s, the height of union power in America after World War II. 1 in 3 workers in America was in union. Highest union density in American history. And that level of union density produced the greatest shared prosperity that this nation had ever seen. Produced the golden age that ironically Republicans are always talking about wanting to go back to as they destroy unions. Today, that level of union density is less than 1 in 10, just fell under 10% union density last year for the first time in 100 years. So from 1 in 3 workers being a union member to fewer than 1 in 10, it's a like enormous and measurable scale of decline of worker power in this country. And along with that, and particularly since the Reagan era, we've had an enormous rise in economic inequality in this country. And many of you have probably seen there's a famous chart with 2 lines on it. One line is union density over time, and it goes down like that. Another line is wealth held by the top 10% in the country, and it goes up like that. And they're perfect mirror images of one another. And so, the destruction and decline of union power and worker power has directly enabled the rise of inequality in this country, which has been going on now for almost 50 years, my whole life. And that big rise in economic inequality is kind of the macro trend that underlies all of our other problems in this country. Like when people look at Trump and when people look at all the ways that are the foundations of our society seem to be collapsing and cracking and institutions failing and oligarchy rising, I mean, all of that is a manifestation of this underlying trend of rising inequality that's been going on for a half century. And so when you think about how to turn around a trend as big as the rise of inequality, there's really only 2 ways to reverse a trend like that. One way is for the government to do it. They can do it with the tax code. They can do it with regulation. They can take money from the top of the income spectrum and fall to the bottom. If you think the US government is going to do that anytime soon, you're more optimistic than me. And the only other way to turn around that trend is for the working class to regain enough power to reclaim their fair share of the wealth produced by the country. And so when I came to understand that, what I came to realize was like unions, even though unions had declined, they were no longer at the center of our culture, they were no longer at the center of our politics, they were no longer at the center of our economy, they were marginalized, they were seen as a niche, they were ignored. Despite all that, unions were still the single most important tool to fix the single most important problem in the whole country. And that is why I think unions are so important and so interesting, and why I tell people, that you need to care about unions, even if you're not in unions, even if you've never thought about unions. Unions have a very direct impact on what the future of this country is going to look like, good or bad, depending on whether they get stronger or weaker. And that the gap between the potential of unions to, I think, really turn around and address the central problem of America and to improve it and to improve our society in a million different ways, the potential is incredible. And then the actual reality of today's labor movement is somewhat disappointing. And the gap between that potential and the reality is sort of has been the subject of a lot of my writing over the years, and it's kind of what my book is about, and is what I've focused on a lot. So again, I don't think I'm telling any of you anything that you don't know, but just trying to give you an example of like giving people that kind of narrative arc and reason to like care about this stuff in the first place. Because, you know, when union density is 33%, everybody, if they're not in a union, then their neighbors in a union, or their dad's in a union, or their cousins in a union, or their friends in a union. Today, that's not the case. You know, with union density at 9.9%, people are not in a union and they don't know anybody in a union. So we really have to start from that perspective of leading people into why this stuff is important. And one other big narrative that I want to touch on before I wrap up today that I think is also very relevant to like the political situation of today is democracy itself. You know, you read the news, there's a ton of discussion about the collapse of American democracy. Democracy is in danger for obvious reasons and for good reasons. But part of that, you know, and part of the rise of fascism is a sort of devaluing of democracy among the general public, you know, people not caring, not valuing democracy enough to protect it. And that is a crisis, but if we think about why people might not value democracy, when do regular people ever experience democracy in their daily lives, right? You're born, you're in a family, that's not a democracy, that's dictatorship. You go to school, school's not a democracy, that's dictatorship. And then you get a job, and the workplace is not a democracy, that's a dictatorship. So, you know, elections are the only kind of pale, fake version of democracy that regular people are ever given a chance to participate in. It's not that surprising that they don't value democracy. But for millions and millions of people in America, the one place where they actually do get to have the lived experience of a democratic organization doing something for them is in a labor union, you know, a good union. If you're in a good union, you get a chance to participate in a democratically run organization that actually does something meaningful for you, improves your life, helps you build power, you know, it helps you do all the things that you want to do through a democratic process. And so unions, I think of them as like schools for democracy. You know, they are a thing that teaches people to value democracy, teaches people that democracy is not just like a buzzword on CNN, you know, a thing that politicians say every 4 years when they want your vote. Like, it is a thing that can actually do something for you in your daily life. And so I also truly believe that, you know, in addition to all the good economic consequences and things like that of widespread union organizing, you know, we're also teaching people to value democracy in a lived experience way that they don't really get through any other part of their lives, which is another good reason to bring back unions and to invest in widespread union organizing. So those are just a couple of, I think, good, meaningful narrative frames that I try to embed my, you know, writing in when I write about this stuff. And I'm going to shut up, but when times are dark politically, when times are dark like this, I have to read my favorite quote. My favorite quote about labor from Eugene Debs, 1904. It's a little bit long, but it's worth it. 10,000 times has the labor movement stumbled and fallen and bruised itself and risen again, been seized by the throat and choked and clubbed into insensibility, enjoined by courts, assaulted by thugs, charged by the militia, shot down by regulars, traduced by the press, frowned upon by public opinion, deceived by politicians, threatened by priests, repudiated by renegades, preyed upon by grafters, infested by spies, deserted by cowards, betrayed by traitors, led by leeches, and sold out by leaders. But notwithstanding all of this and all these, it is today the most vital and potential power this planet has ever known. And its historic mission of emancipating the workers of the world from the thraldom of the ages is as certain of ultimate realization as is the setting of the sun. Thank you.
I have a tiny mouse voice. Can you guys all hear me okay? In the back and everything? Okay. I know I don't look like I should have a tiny mouse voice, but you know. So, isn't he great? Can you give him another? Since we're doing quotes, there's one that I thought of as you were speaking that kind of applies to my own experience getting into the labor world and becoming a labor journalist. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are familiar with Big Bill Haywood. One of my favorite quotes from him, he was head of the Western Federation of Miners, an early kind of labor icon, eye patch, big boy, really just a fun guy to Google. He was known for saying, I haven't read Marx's Capital, but I bear the marks of capital on my body. And I know that's a funny thing for a journalist to say, but stay with me. I want to tell you a little bit about how I got into this. And, you know, I don't want to throw any curveballs at you, but I didn't have a very traditional path into this world. It's not I never thought I would end up speaking at a university or having to buy a blazer or anything like that. It's here we are. Obviously, I didn't bring it because I don't know how it works yet. I started out well, I'm from a really rural place. I grew up in a nature preserve in South Jersey. Not like Bada Bing, Jersey, like farms and buried bodies, Jersey. And I'm from a union family. I'm third generation. Every man in my family worked construction or was a steel worker. All the women were either teachers or stayed home with the kids. Or my mom, she was a lunch lady at my high school and was so much cooler than me. Like, do not even worry about that. She was friends with the football players and I was wearing black lipstick. So it wasn't a competition. But I come from a union family, but I didn't really know anything about unions, really. I just knew that that was something that was it was part of it was kind of in the general universe of our lives. Like sometimes my dad would have to go to union meetings. He would complain about how boring they were, like how crooked everyone was because he was in a Jersey building trade. So he might have had some valid complaints. Or the time he had to go down to the Capitol in Trenton and protest against Scott Walker, who was doing all those horrible cuts in Wisconsin in 2011. And it was really just not something I thought about because I was a kid until I was a little bit of an older kid and my mom got really sick at work and she had to go to the hospital and was there for a very long time. And it's still something that we're dealing with. She's still around, but figuring out that her hospital bills ran into the millions of dollars. And I remember seeing one for like $250,000. As a 17-year-old, I was like, that doesn't seem right. Can they do that? My dad had really good union health insurance. And knowing that, learning about that, and realizing the only reason my mom was alive was because my dad was part of this union was a really crucial early lesson. As I was kind of wending my way into the workforce. And I didn't come into labor journalism or even regular journalism in anything resembling a traditional trajectory. I started out in the music business, believe it or not. And I spent really the first, I guess, 15, almost 20 years of my life writing about heavy metal bands and touring with heavy metal bands and working for heavy metal record labels and basically doing every possible heavy metal related job besides having any musical talent whatsoever. And I kind of figured it would always be like that. My biggest goal ever was like, I want to be the editor-in-chief of Metal Maniacs magazine or something like that. And I kind of carried that through my teens and 20s, and I really never thought that would change until I ended up turning 27 and I was off my dad's health insurance. My back was starting to hurt from sleeping on floors and in vans and just ridiculous punk houses across the country. And I thought, okay, I should get a job. What can I do? And I knew a guy who worked at Vice. And in 2014, that was how you got a job at Vice. You just kind of knew a guy. And I ended up working for Noisy, their music website. And I was really lucky in that 2 weeks after I got hired full-time, because they kept me in a like contract purgatory for a good 8 months, where I worked 40 hours a week but didn't get any benefits. Classic media case. Um, 2 weeks after, and I was the heavy metal editor, which was a job you could have for a very brief point in time. Around the same time, Hamilton was writing the real stuff. I mean, heavy metal is real stuff too, but it had a slightly smaller footprint, I would say, than the things that are impacting Amazon workers or, all the other stuff that's going to Gawker. I had a niche and I was happy with my niche and I figured I would just stay in my niche forever. But 2 weeks after I got hired full time, one of my coworkers pulled me aside and said, "Hey, we're thinking about unionizing. What do you think about that?" And my first response, "Oh, thank God." Because even though I was much, much, much less well-versed in unions than I am now, or Hamilton was then, I knew just in my going back to being a kid lizard brain, oh, unions are good. Unions help. And I knew, even though it was like a fun job in a lot of ways and a cool job in a lot of ways, it was also kind of a messed up job in a lot of ways. Our wages were really low. There's very little transparency in anything. Our management was a mess. It was, I don't know how much you know about Vice, sort of RIP, but there are a lot of sexual harassment scandals. And there's a lot going on that should not have been going on in a workplace. But it was sort of papered over in that mid to late 2000s, like, it's like, we're cool. Like, do cocaine with your boss. It's no big deal. It was. I was more of a whiskey gal, but I've heard things. So it's kind of a wild environment, and we decided we need to do something about it. So we unionized. We talked to our coworkers, and we signed our cards. And this was early enough in that aforementioned digital media organizing boom that our bosses didn't really know what hit them. Gawker unionized first, and we saw that, and we're like, oh, cool. But our bosses weren't paying attention to that. They were busy just, I don't know, being rich and buying the Entourage mansion and buying all that cocaine. So they didn't know what to do when we unionized. So we sent in our letter, and a half hour later, they just responded like, okay, like voluntary recognition. And much like your experience with the organizers being like, what, you're doing this publicly, our organizers with the Writers Guild, like, they just emailed back, okay. They just recognized your union in a half hour. And we're like, yeah, okay, that seems fine. We had no idea at the time what an uphill battle we were beginning to fight. We had a pretty charmed beginning to that. And it was wild because that was happening in 2015. I think 2016, we nailed down our first contract. At the time, it was, I think, ratified. I was in the Netherlands at a heavy metal festival. So I was a couple hours ahead of what was happening, and I didn't have any Wi-Fi, but I just kind of, I got a text. We won. But it was, the whole experience was really incredible. And it was happening in the backdrop of people, a lot of people in my generation, my cohort, really trying to pay really close attention to politics in a big way. And the first time for a lot of folks, because this was, Bernie, this was Trump 1.0. This was all those very significant elections that we look back on and certainly don't laugh at. And I was already involved in a lot of organizing, just kind of like anti-fascist stuff in New York at the time. So I thought, okay, organizing with the union, organizing against the Proud Boys for the protests, this all makes sense. I'm going to bring this kind of political perspective into this work. And I was still doing my day job, writing about heavy metal on the internet. And I just kind of found myself being pulled away from it. Obviously, I still loved what I loved. I still was part of my community. I still listened to all the same things, but I kind of felt like my energy was needed somewhere else because, not to brag, but I was really good about writing about heavy metal. And I figured, okay, if I can write about this stuff, about this genre of globally significant, incredibly culturally and musically and artistically rich genre that doesn't get a lot of attention outside of a pretty specific demographic, a pretty specific world, then like writing about labor must be easy because everyone cares about that. And I found myself kind of trying to chip my way into writing about this stuff. But I had no idea how you would do such a thing because my introduction to journalism was just start writing for zines when you're 15 and hope it works out. Like, I don't think I've even ever had a journalism class. I went to college for a while, but then it seemed like a better idea to go on tour with my friend's band than finish my math classes. And there's a reason why I've never been to grad school. They want you to have a degree before you go. I didn't think about being a journalist really, or being part of any kind of mainstream political world in that way. I just wanted to write about the stuff I cared about. But the stuff I cared about increasingly became apparent was in the labor world. And I started pitching little articles here and there. And at the same time, I was also kind of struggling a little bit with, I guess, just the existing as a very working class person in a media environment, a work environment that was not necessarily hospitable or equipped for that. A lot of my coworkers came from very different worlds than me. And I mean, we got along fine, but there were just some moments, especially in the earlier parts of the Trump campaign, when I remember the specific moment when there was some kind of photo essay about Trump voters. And I remember people kind of gathered around a screen, just kind of making fun of the people. They're, heavy set white people, probably got their clothes at Walmart or Kohl's or whatever. And my coworkers were like, oh, look at these dumb, ugly rednecks. It's like, they look exactly like everyone in my family. Cool. And I remember hearing other folks and other desks, oh, how do we get in touch with like a Trump supporter? Where do we find one? Like, I can call my Uncle Jimmy. I don't know if you really want to get it started, but like, or we like, are you like, what? Like, and it just kind of really emphasized to me the fact that I was really lucky to have kind of ended up in that position. So I think a lot of kids who grew up where I did and the way I did don't even get a chance to write professionally or access that kind of audience or move to New York. Like, there's so many people who are, I'm sure, much smarter than me and much better at writing than me that are stuck the same way I would have been if really my grandparents had not had good union jobs and saved up to send me to college long enough for me to figure out how to pull it off. And I just thought about that a lot too while we were organizing, because I never came across anybody who was anti-union amongst my coworkers. It was people that were either completely just did not understand what a union was or had no idea how it could apply to a job like ours. And I thought it was the strangest thing. And it was a little bit of a lonely feeling. But then as we organized and I got to know more people in the New York City extended labor cinematic universe, I realized like, oh, I'm not alone. There are other people like me. And I do belong here. I'm doing something worthwhile. And I guess I just have always had that chip on my shoulder. And it served me pretty well because, being a black sheep isn't a bad thing. The labor movement is full of black sheep. And as I was trying to pitch these stories and starting to try and figure out what labor journalism was or how I could do it, I decided like, okay, I'm not going to give into this imposter syndrome thing. I'm going to tell myself, look, I organized my workplace. I bargained contracts. I've read tons of books. I've gotten to know our labor lawyers. This has become my new favorite band. Like I've treated labor history the same way I treated, Swedish death metal when I was 15. Like, I need to know everything. Because not only do I care about this, not only am I interested, when I was that age, when I was getting into metal, I was a girl. I was a teenage girl. And I don't know how well versed you guys are in the demographics of the American metal scene, but I was not amongst the minority. And a lot of people I encountered wrote me off. Felt like you're only here because there's guys here. You're only here because it's cool. Like, you don't actually care about this. So I was like, okay, well, I need to know everything about this so I can show you without a shadow of doubt that I belong here. And that's kind of the way I approached writing about labor. it was just memorizing different acronyms, basically. Like I was already primed to try and, I was used to trying to acquire an encyclopedic knowledge of something that, again, was pretty specific. And it worked out okay. Because I was coming from a non-traditional background, because little part of me felt like I didn't quite deserve to write about labor. I didn't belong there. I was like, you know what? I'm going to read everything. And I think that served me well. I think learning about labor's history is, of course, it's important just in general, but especially if you're coming from that background and you really kind of need to feel like you do belong and the people just like you have done this work and succeeded. I mean, that's what keeps people coming to the movement. It's not necessarily the stories of the great men, even though their libraries are delightful. It's the stories of everybody else. I mean, that's what, I mean, wrote a whole book about that, but we'll get to that. And then just taking that approach and pitching a couple of publications, like, look, I'm really interested in this history stuff. Here's something I found out about. Can I write about this? It worked, but it took a little bit of doing. I think what really cemented my nascent career as a labor journalist was writing for Teen Vogue, which is always the one that people kind of point at and are like, what? Teen Vogue? What are the kids into? I'm like, I don't know. I'm 37. I'm terrified of that. But I appreciate the need to create accessible and engaging and entertaining media for people that might not necessarily want to pick up one of the very thorough and necessary important works of academic labor literature that are available somewhere. You know, like if we want to talk to the people, why not get them young? So I remember pitching the first labor related thing I pitched was a kind of girl bossy biography piece of Mother Jones. So I thought, oh, that's easy. She was a badass lady, labor lady, and that it would be great for young people and young women to learn about her. And my editor told me, that's a cool idea, but I don't think our readers will know what a union is. Why don't you write something about that first? So, okay. So I did just a little basic, like what a union is and how it works. And I went out into the internet, the interwaves, and it got a decent chunk of attention because this was like 2017 or so. This was before Teen Vogue became the vanguard of the revolution. It was unexpected. And a lot of labor folks, I think, took notice. And being a scrappy hustler type, when I noticed that they got a recognition from the Sidney Hill Foundation for their social justice coverage that mentioned that article, I hit up my editor again. It's like, what if you gave me a labor column? And she said, okay, like there's plenty of pixels to go around this internet. I've been doing that ever since. And I really think it's not only kind of given me a way to learn how to become a labor journalist, you know, working with real fact checkers, editors, and all of the incredibly important kind of structural roles that are rapidly disappearing across the media industry. It was really cool to be able to talk to younger people or people that weren't necessarily going to seek out labor writing, but maybe it popped up and it caught their attention. And I think that is really the reason people started letting me get away with writing about labor in other places. But it worked, you know? And that approach is what I took into writing my book, which came out a few years ago, which is another one of those things that I never thought I'd get to do. Like, all the kids I grew up with are still there, or in the army, or in jail, or dead. And I have a book out on Silent Schuster about people like us, about the people that got left out or left behind, but still contributed so much and worked so hard and bled for the rights and wages and dignity that they deserved. As I was researching the book, I was interested in what the headliners were up to, of course. Like, of course I mentioned Cesar Chavez, of course I mentioned, you know, Mother Jones is in there, all of that. But it was the people that were kind of tucked away in the footnotes or were kind of mentioned in an aside, or where there wasn't that much information about them. That's what I wanted to find. That was kind of what I was doing with my Teen Vogue column. That's what I try to do with all of my work. I'm interested in the stories that got left out because there's always a reason those stories aren't there. Someone like Emma Tenayuka, one of my faves. What a gal. She was a Mexican-American organizer in Texas in the 30s she was radical, she was a communist, and she was really, really good at organizing. She led an enormous pecan sheller strike in, I think, 1933, San Antonio, and did a killer job. But then the union leadership didn't like her style, didn't like her politics, and they sent in this white guy to take over. And he wasn't as connected with the workers, who were also Mexican and Mexican-American workers. He wasn't as militant. And it didn't work out as well. And she got basically red baited and blacklisted out of the story. And that's not an uncommon thing to come across in the history of labor in this country. There are a lot of really interesting and effective organizers who were too something, too red, or too black, or too queer, or too feminine, or just too something. And that's the story of labor right now, too. Like something, I really appreciated what you were saying about the way that labor impacts politics and these big Democrat, like the big picture. And I'm so glad you write that stuff because I get to focus on what I find even more interesting in some ways about the purpose and possibility of labor journalism and labor itself is finding ways to bridge these gaps and divides between different kinds of people, between the people that got written out and the people that might have wanted to write them out. So that sounds very vague, but I think about the fact that I come from this very conservative, rural, white, terrible politics having kind of family. And then they ended up with me. And the horseshoe of where we end up being able to talk about really anything besides like the nature channel without fighting is union stuff. And that's something that I've seen play out in so many different places with so many different industries and so many kinds of workers. One of the stories, I guess like industries I've followed the closest over the past few years has been like the plight of coal miners first in Alabama and then in Central Appalachia. And that's a really complex and interesting group of workers, a complex demographic that is so easy to paint as one type of person that stands behind Trump at a photo op and has bad political opinions and looks like my dad. And then there's all the other people that are involved. And then there's the guys that look like my dad that have really good politics. And then there's ones that don't, but are still managed to be good people. Like I can't, I'm being a little vague, but I'll tell you what I mean. Example, when I went down to Alabama in 21, started covering this coal miner strike that was happening right around the same time that Amazon workers in Bessemer were trying to organize. And that was like this huge story, as it should have been. And this coal miner strike with the UMWA kicked off right down the road. And I thought, oh, that's going to be the next big story. I got down there. And then it wasn't at all for 2 years. They were on strike for 2 years and it got very little media attention. But I got stuck in. I saw something in those folks that reminded me of home, I guess. And just getting to know those folks and talking to them about politics, about their kids, about all the things that you talk to when you're just on a picket line with someone for hours. And I realized that they were socialists, there were deeply religious people, there are young people that were more on my wavelength, where they're not really that interested. There are Latino workers, there are young women, there are all kinds of different people that have come together for this common cause that otherwise would not have brought them in the same room. And yeah, there's some Trump guys here. Yeah, there's people that are not happy about their Trump hats, but they're trying to make life better for all of them, for everyone. And those same workers who are on strike would show up to support Starbucks workers in Birmingham when they were organizing. And they would show up at the Amazon workers rallies and vice versa. and really just seeing up close the power that labor has to bring together different types of people, different outlooks and different identities and different political opinions, even in a way that is actually beneficial for the whole. It gave me so much hope, honestly, because prior to that, I'd like to say the only other time I was around that many Trump supporters was like Christmas. So it really reshaped even some of my perspective as a journalist, as someone who's covering worker stories, that, you know, nothing is black and white. And that's sort of driven me to not find, but like help tell the stories of other groups of workers that are maybe a little less sympathetic in some way. Like, but the last story I wrote was about oil field truck drivers who are being made to transport hazardous materials without their knowledge, which is grim on multiple levels. But I had a great time talking to them, and I'm glad I got to write that story. It's the response online was not perhaps as sympathetic as when I would write about striking transit workers or striking teachers. But if an injury to one means an injury to all is something that we're really gonna hold on to, then you gotta talk to the people doing jobs that are complicated and dirty and ugly too. That's something that I kind of hold on to. I get a little, the chip on my shoulder starts digging in, especially around coal miners. Because that is a really, really struggling population of workers, but there's so little sympathy. And I get it, the world is on fire, but that doesn't mean like my friends in West Virginia need to suffer. It's like Hamilton was saying about the system of it all. So much of this systemic pain being inflicted it's expected that individual workers bear that cost and bear that guilt. And I don't really think that's fair, but there's a lot about this system that isn't fair. And I think having that perspective and holding on to your own political analysis and political orientation is really important in this work. I know that journalists are supposed to be objective, and we're supposed to not have any bias, and we're supposed to go in and just tell the facts. But that's not how labor journalism works, because that's just not how it goes. There's always a bad guy, and there's always a good guy. It might get a little complicated. There might be a couple layers involved, but ultimately, workers versus boss, like there's always someone you should be rooting for. And I have a lot of opinions about the way that some publications approach that. But I'm really glad that we do have these pro-labor, like more progressive publications, like In These Times or Labor Notes or The Nation even, and a handful of others that understand that you have to have an opinion. Like you can't pretend to be objective about people's lives. I think that folks that are able to do that perhaps should pick a different job. If the New York Times would like someone like me to be in there, no, I still probably wouldn't pick up, but and I think that's something that kind of is not unique to labor journalism, but I think it's an intrinsic part of it that we do care that much on a personal level and on a political level, because so many of us have organized or come from these families or just in community with poor and working class people that live these struggles every day. Like, I think it's a really valuable perspective that isn't valued or resourced or really respected enough. I'm a little biased as a labor journalist, but I do think it's something that we need as humans. We're talking about telling labor's story, getting people to pay attention to story-led unions, and some of the internal stuff, getting in the weeds that might not be the sexiest story, but with labor stories, you can always find the people in them. That's what I think keeps me interested, finding the people's stories, because people are fascinating. Everyone is so weird. Everyone has so many interesting things about them. Like every worker is a universe. And I feel so lucky to get to do this job because I am so nosy and so curious, like you said. And I just don't know if it would hit the same if I was like a business journalist or a tech journalist. So that's also labor journalism. Everything's labor journalism. They don't tell you that. But it's also connected. And speaking of getting the story out there, I am lucky enough to get to do a bunch of events like this and talk to communicators and talk to rank and file folks. And they often ask, like, how do we get people like you guys to pay attention? How do we ensure that our email is the one that you pay attention to? And you've gotten 20 almost identical ones from different unions about different struggles. That all matters so much. And the one piece of advice I try to give is to spend a little bit of time preparing the workers themselves to talk to us, to tell their stories. Like, there was just a really big, really intense strike in Philly, where I live. A bunch of the sanitation workers and city workers went on strike for very, very good reason. They're so underpaid. They keep the city running and they get paid. I think Philly's sanitation workers, for example, are some of the lowest paid in the country. And so they went on strike. And it got a lot of attention, but it could have gotten more. And I think they could have built up a little bit, even more public support if they had made more workers available to speak to them. And journalists are scary. You can't trust all of us. Media is weird. I get that. But it's worth it to spend a little bit of time doing a little bit of media training. Identify someone who feels safe and secure speaking out. Because you could have the most dynamic leader, like union president in the world, but hearing from him is not going to hit the same as hearing from, say, a mother on the picket line who's like, I can't feed my baby. That's the story. It's not, 4 years ago we negotiated this and like this percentage. It's about the people being hurt by this policy or by this lack of support. And I think you have to earn workers' trust and earn union folks' trust and put a decent amount of elbow grease into showing that you're one of the good ones, or at least one of the journalists who get it. Because I've also seen journalists who kind of parachute into these big strikes or big labor actions. And I've heard, I still remember being in Alabama when the Amazon workers were trying to organize in Bessemer. And I'd been there for like 2 weeks at that point, and I knew everybody. It was a small union hall. I think I was like eating the chicken sandwich or something, watching all these fancy journalists run around and asking the poor communications person, I need a worker. Can you get me a worker? And I'm like, do you mean Jennifer or Daryl? Like, people have work. Like, what do you mean? Ew, that's such a strange way to go about that. I don't think you should be writing this story, Doc. But it comes down to it, but I got to talk to lots of folks because they trusted me, because they showed up and I made it clear that I was on their side. And I know some publications you can't do that, but probably a lot less fun to write for. And that's why you see so many labor journalists and even journalists who have like very strong political perspectives striking out on their own or starting newsletters, starting their own publications, because it really is hard out here. Like, not for nothing, we're probably two of the better known, like, I guess, younger labor journalists out there, and I haven't had a real job since 2019. And like the industry's really shrunk in a really scary way. I was just talking to someone, one of the workers here before we came in, about the threat of AI and just the devaluation of reading and words and journalism in general. And it's scary. But I mean, so far we still get to do this. And like Hamilton was saying, I think we do play a really crucial role in the labor movement. Now, we were talking to a couple other folks earlier about how there used to be a really robust labor press. Every union had a newsletter, every labor council had a magazine. Like, you couldn't escape union news if you wanted to. And I just think back to how much it would have helped me when I was just getting into organizing if I had had those lying around the house when I was a kid. Because my granddad was a steel worker, my dad's operating engineers, like my grandma's AFT at NEA. Like, any one of those would have prepared me so much better for that organizing that I got to do as a young adult. And it might have given me a leg up when I was like 16 and got my first dishwashing job and had the creepiest boss in the world and thought I couldn't do anything about it. If I'd known more about unions and about the power of collective action, maybe me and the other guys could have done something. And I guess part of what I see as my job is getting as much out there as I can to younger people, to people that aren't employed, people that are employed, just anybody I can get. Because you never know which article or which interview or which essay is gonna find that person when they need it. And look, there's only a handful of us, but we're doing our best. And I just think it's a really cool job. You know, I didn't know what the heck I was getting into when I started this. I didn't know the labor journalism existed. Like when I first started organizing and trying to write about labor, I certainly didn't know about Studs Terkel. I didn't even know about Steve Greenhouse. Like I knew about you because I thought your vlogs were funny. But I think there's a lot of folks that have gotten into the labor journalism world or labor journalism adjacent world just by doing it, by organizing, which is how most workers get involved in unions. So I guess we have a little bit of a leg up on that respect. And not for nothing, I know I have in addition to my non-traditional path into journalism, I also have a little bit of a non-traditional look to me. And honestly, I do think it's kind of helped. At the very least, if I'm going to a job site or, you know, talking to oil field workers or talking to people at a music venue, they know I'm not a narc. Like they know I'm probably a little bit cool. But then again, I'm not necessarily the person you want to send to cover a grad student workers strike because they probably won't let me in the building. Like, I think knowing your strengths as an individual really helps with this type of work because it is so personal. And you're asking people to tell you about the worst things in their lives. And I've worked some pretty shitty jobs. Like, it can be kind of embarrassing. Like, oh, my boss is doing this to us. Like, this is how much I make. Like, all these terrible things are happening. Like, it's hard to tell people that sort of thing, as people are very proud, as they should be. And a lot of workers aren't afforded that much dignity in the jobs they have. So when you're in our position and you're entrusted with those stories, I feel like you better make goddamn sure that you make it worth it for those people and you make them feel seen and make sure they're protected and just let them know that people do care because workers are not valued the way they should be or respected the way they should be. And this is such a atomized and cruel and isolated sort of society that has been built up around us against our will. That doing this kind of work it feels almost like a calling. I'm getting a little mystical at this point, but I just really appreciate that I have the opportunity to do this work. And I hope that we're able to keep doing it, whether that's through unions and labor organizations funding more publications or somehow grants appearing for working class writers or gosh, I don't even know. Because it's so dark that I'm not even quite sure what would fix it. But I know that there is hope because there's always hope. That's the whole point of the labor movement. And I guess that is the note that I would end on, that there's always hope that things will get better. And if the work that we do helps show people that light when they need it, then all the other bullshit's worth it. Yeah.
The dreadful thing about listening to these two is that, of course, there's 60 things that I want to say. I would remind the Mary Dean Boris view the labor press as one of the most important aspects for the survival of the labor movement.
She's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and I think that there's a history here of the labor press rising and falling and rising and falling again. But here we are at this moment, and you all have been very patient. So do we have some questions or comments?
Someone's gotta be first.
So, well, let me ask, Hamilton, I appreciated what you said about unions being a vehicle for very about democracy in this country. I think that's true, but how do you see developing more activities, more involvement of workers in their unions? If you're joining a union, you can participate, you can get involved in bargaining, strikes and so on, but in the day-to-day level, how can you develop more of an appreciation among workers for their unions and participation in their unions? You go to a
Yes.
union meeting and, it's usually just a small minority of people who show up.
Yeah, it's really important, and we were talking about this a little bit before, how in the old days, unions used to have softball games and picnics and sports leagues and community types of activities to get people involved in the union that aren't just like another union meeting to go to about the contract, so I think that's important. I think in unions that do a good job of getting people involved, like Unite Here, for example, do continual internal organizing. I mean, a lot of that is on the shoulders of the union itself to constantly be working to engage members. I think it's very easy for unions to get lazy, essentially, and just and not really go out of their way to do that work. And it's the internal organizing of your own members in the union is just as important as the organizing of new members, which I think is vital, which is extremely important. But the unions that do a good job that I've reported on, are constantly, have staff dedicated to internal organizing, are always reaching out to their members. Political education, have classes for the members, have workshops, like get people to go to rallies, like the culinary union in Las Vegas has citywide meetings like multiple times per year where they try to pull all the membership into a stadium. Basically, it's like 50,000 people, but they will go, their organizers will go out into the shops and contact every worker and be like, are you coming to the quarterly meeting, yes or no? Like just doing that basic outreach to keep people engaged in the union, I think is work that frankly a lot of unions just don't do any of that. And so it's work, but I think it pays off. And one of the things that Kim talked about when she was talking about the coal miners and the ways that unions can cut across those political lines, I think that's such an important factor for why unions are important, especially right now, because if the whole theme of the American political press right now is that we are so divided, we're so divided, we're so divided. And when I see that, I'm like, wait, I know something, we have something that can cut across these lines, and you don't see so much in the press, anybody standing up and saying, hey, unions can be the bridge between these two sides. So yeah, it's important.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your wonderful insight into the labor movement and the overlap with journalism. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about what you both kind of hinted at, that it's important, it's a good union. Especially because we talked about different things that happen to people because they're women, they're Latina, they're queer, whatever. So for labor journalism, how much have you been covering also problems within unions? Sexual harassment or politics of power, differentials that need to not so good union dynamics that might be temporary at stakes. But are you reporting about that, or is that seen as hurting overall the labor movement, or how do you square that as a labor journalist?
That's all you, buddy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is a real, I think some people that write about labor can have that feeling of like, if I write about any problems with unions, I'm hurting the labor movement, or it's such an uphill battle that labor is in such a deep hole right now that it does feel like, oh, anything negative we write is like bad. I think that's a wrong approach. I think if you're a journalist, you write about whatever the news is, and it makes the labor movement stronger to talk about its failings. And so I write critical things about the labor movement, and I think if you care about the labor movement, you want to do better, so all of us are writing from a place of wanting it to be good and wanting to make it better. Yeah, so I think that is a real thing. I think it's a little misguided, but again, like, we just need more labor journalists. Like, if you look at political journalism, it's not like people are like, don't write anything bad about members of Congress, because that would be like anti-politics. That's not like, we're grown-ups here. I want to see a healthy labor press where we can write about unions just like everything else in society.
That's true, and I differ a little bit, just because I'm a little bit more of a Pollyanna about things, and kind of like we're saying that you decide what stories you're going to cover through freelance and what you pitch to people. I honestly do tend to prefer writing more positive stories about organizing or about marginalized workers who are kind of winning or doing something interesting, because I know Hamilton will take care of the other stuff. Because I know he's good at what he does, and I'm pretty decent at what I do. And there's other people that are also very good at, the labor journalism community. Again, there's like, you can count them on my fingers, and that's not saying very much. So it's okay, you can laugh. But I do kind of find myself gravitating towards the more inspiring things, because as much as it is crucial to criticize ourselves and build the stronger movement we need, we also need to give people hope and bring them in, and not, I think, give in to this still fairly prevalent, like, unions are corrupt, union bosses are bad. Like, there's so much negative press, or just misguided, or just unknowledgeable and uninformed, ignorant. Pick your poison. That whenever unions are written about in sort of the mainstream world, there's always something that's wrong or weird or just annoying. Like, how many times have we seen the AFL-CIO referred to as a union?
Or
And I kind of, maybe it's a little bit of a cop-out, but I do tend to veer towards the nicer stories. Also because, everyone here who works for a union is very cool, but sometimes if you write a critical story about a union, then you don't get access to them anymore. And that can be really challenging, because if a union or a union leader or something comes out that is not cool, not helpful, not beneficial, but then a few months later, the next year, they do something really interesting, and there's, a big campaign, and you're locked out of it, and that just kind of sucks for everybody, because unions are made up of people, and people can be a little petty, a little sensitive. We're all human. Well, yeah, Hamilton's tougher than me, basically.
It comes to mind that framing the whole question of the labor movement is a very fascinating problem. I spent 40 years teaching workers, and the thing that I had quite a bit of success with was to ask two questions. First of all, what happens if the boss doesn't come to work today? And some smart ass would always say, things will run better. I would then follow that up with another question. Please name for me one item or service that is not produced by workers. One item. There isn't any item that isn't produced by workers. From the shoes on your feet to the lights over our head, workers produce everything. My father said to me, workers produce everything. Bosses produce nothing. And people lose sight of that. The old labor theory of value, put forward by the early bourgeois economists, summarizes very nicely the situation. If workers produce everything of value, why don't workers have a larger role in decision-making in our society? Leading into your notion of the union as a school for democracy. Just a couple of thoughts over the years.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and you know, that whole issue of framing is so important, and you know, I've found, I'm sure you found too, like if you try to talk to people about labor or unions, they might start from the, you know, the view of their own politics. I mean, they might say, I'm a Republican, so unions are corrupt and blah, 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 blah. You know, but if you're like, does your boss suck? They'll say yes. Like everybody has that, you know, and if you start from that point and move out, you'll find that they can actually become noteworthy.
Just want to say that I really loved seeing some of the chatter online around AI and around workers losing their jobs. I've seen some people suggest that CEOs be automated out because they don't actually do anything. And I do think that is fun. I think that is a correct framing for that sort of problem.
Hey, I had a question about, it kind of comes from the last two contributions about like, when you read most journalism or most like media, it's everything is talking to you as if you're a consumer, right? And like the coverage of so many strikes is as a consumer issue. Right? Oh, do people can't get to the store on time, or you know, like parents are stressed out. Like there's, you know, they don't talk about the actual workplace issues, or talk about that this is and workers are at the center of this issue. And I think that really ties into what you were saying, Hamilton, about like democracy, right? Like 100 years ago, there was not only press that talked to people as workers, there was like a lot more press outlets that were like owned by workers, right? That were directly for workers, and then workers would read together and all that stuff. And now it's very much just a consumption. How do you find a way as kind of differing voices to address your readers as workers and not just as like another consumer product, even when you're working in larger spaces, like, you know, that often didn't matter to you?
One framing that I've found to be really effective, especially when we're talking about strikes, service disruptions, is kind of like taking that irritation and that annoyance and then focusing it in the correct direction. For example, when we almost had that real big railroad strike before, you know, so much of the coverage was like, this is going to ruin your Christmas. People aren't going to get their stuff. And I think a more appropriate framing is like, how dare these railroad bosses do this to you, the consumer? Or like in Philly with the sanitation workers strike, it got real gnarly. There was a lot of trash.
Yeah.
And people started referring to the garbage as Parker piles. Our mayor's name is Cheryl Parker. Yeah. And just kind of directing that general consumer irritation towards the actual source of the problem. Because those workers wouldn't be on strike if they had been offered a reasonable contract. And I think you can kind of work with that, because when it comes to that kind of coverage too, there's not necessarily always that level of depth to say like, yeah, the workers go on strike because they want more money, but like, why? Like, what are they? How much are they being underpaid? How much like why would someone do this? Being on strike sucks. And emphasizing that too, like, it's not just like a fun holiday. Like, folks are worried about paying their bills because someone with more money decided they weren't worth it. And I think that's a pretty decent framing for riling people up and directing the anger in a useful direction. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. I mean, what you're really asking is like, why isn't there class consciousness in America? And you know, it's not an accident. I mean, and even on the media level, it's not an accident. You know, why does every newspaper have a business section and not have a labor section? One way I think of labor journalism is the business section from the perspective of human beings. Like that's kind of what labor journalism is. And yet every publication has a business section written from the perspective of capital. You know, so that's capitalism at work. And people are trained from the day they're born to think of themselves like that. I mean, that runs really, really deep in the American psyche. And it's, you know, it's absolutely true that as a labor journalist, you have to sort of try to climb that hill every time you write a story. And that's, you know, that is a time when it is really useful to talk about people's experiences, you know, talk about the mom who can't pay for the kid's shoes, like talk, you know, you have to try to put people into the mind of themselves as a worker. And in many cases, it's a way that people have never thought about themselves before, which sounds crazy since we all are workers, but it's the same thing probably that a union organizer would tell you. You know, it's not really any different. It's like when we organize my workplace, you know, these people were all, or most of the overwhelming majority were leftists or progressives, or they would describe themselves like that. But they had never really thought of themselves in those terms. And so you know, that's also the source of the common anti-union sentiments that you hear is like, we're going to mess up the company. You're like, who are we? Like, you know, we're trying to make a living here. Like, but it's very, very deeply ingrained. Yeah.
It seems like the right wing has been able to use these new technologies and the internet and new communication, ways of communicating much more effectively than the left and the labor has been able to. What can labor and the left do to counter that, the effectiveness of the right wing, and to use those technologies more effectively?
There aren't that many lefty billionaires, unfortunately. That's kind of because it's kind of like airplane food, you know, it doesn't quite work. But I mean, the basic fact is that people on the right wing have a lot more money because they're much more pro capital, pro business. Like Peter Thiel isn't gonna teach us how to do TikTok, you know, and then it's not fully down to money, but it's a lot of it. And we just don't have the same amount of resources. Because there's lots of really smart, charismatic people on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube who are creating really good, useful, pro-union, pro-labor, class-conscious content. I hate that word.
And it's not
here.
getting out.
I think I would say like I don't think the right is better at using those tools. I think that the right has more resources, like Kim said. I mean,
And owns a lot of them.
yeah, right. It's, you know, if you've ever tried to, you know, I've been in some rooms where you're like trying to raise money for media, left-wing media, labor media. Like it's a fucking struggle, man. And meanwhile, there's a lady named Barry Weiss who was a refugee from the New York Times because it was too woke and started her website, and now she has $400 million. Like, how did that happen? She's a shitty writer. She's not that smart. Your product is not that insightful, but it fills a niche that is popular with people who have $400 million to invest. And that's not, it's the opposite is true, especially of labor journalism, right? Not even just left journalism, but like specifically labor journalism is, we're trying to take your money away. Like that's our pitch to funders. It's like, we want you to have less. Yeah, if we succeed, you will have less. So please fund us. So it's not that compelling of a pitch. But I think if you look on social media and stuff like that, there's tons of good, smart. You saw Zoran's campaign in New York City was really video driven, and you see that kind of talent that's there. On TikTok, More Perfect Union is like a video based site that does really good labor journalism. So I think the talent is there. It's more a question of resources.
And not for nothing, I saw like fairly recently the Democratic Party said they were going to funnel a ton of money into influencers and new media and like the kind of media that you're talking about. But the problem is the people, like regular normal people, do not necessarily share the policy goals and opinions of the current Democratic Party leadership.
Right.
So there's tons of pretty influential and interesting creators, like someone like Hassan, a guy that streams on wherever one streams, who is charismatic and cute and has good political opinions, but he's too complicated for like the Democratic Party line because he, supports Palestine, anti-genocide, pretty easy, but not for the Democratic Party. So it's the creators are there, the people are interested, but the powers that control the money machine lever do not want to elevate those voices. And so we're just kind of stuck. We're just kind of stuck, like DIY pump style, trying to get the message out there however we can, with kind of everyone else against us. Like when you write things that the people that have money like, they're more likely to give it to you. But as Hamilton said, nobody with any money likes anything we have to say, and they don't want us to get in front of more of an audience. So it's really like a people-powered thing. The only reason labor press or progressive media as it exists is because it's funded by donations from people. A couple rich people that aren't totally evil will fund a few things, but there's far fewer not totally evil rich people than there are very evil rich people. And I don't know how you fix that unless we just take all their money, which I think is a pretty good solution.
I can just throw in here, I think there's also just a question of how much space there is out there. People only have so much attention, so much time. And if we have people with a ton of money, even if it's the same message repeated 60 million times in a particular day, that drowns out a lot of the sound of the few. And whatever quality that story is, sometimes gets lost in the white noise of our publications, right? And so I think really the question is, like, is there any way to break through that? And is there any way to sort of, I mean, my most radical thought is that it's good that the right is buying up all these central broadcast networks because nobody's watching them anywhere. That maybe one key is that by having access to, for however long we have access to, a digital and online media, we probably will get more traction there right now than, we're never going to see another positive labor story on CBS.
Yeah,
Then again, all the social media platforms are owned by evil right-wing billionaires. So social media itself is not the most useful. We got to build our own stuff. I think it's basically what it comes down to.
like I really think that the real solution to the journalism crisis in America is government funding of journalism, which exists in other Western countries, the BBC and Canada. Unfortunately, our politics are running the opposite direction of that. But like the economic model that produced journalism for the past 150 years has been smashed in the last 10 years. So ad-supported journalism does not work anymore. And if we want to have journalism of all types, quality journalism, it's going to have to be publicly supported. Now, when will the political will for that come around? We're not very close yet, but you can run down the list of ways to make money, and ultimately it's going to have to be like a collective decision that journalism is a public good. And people want, in your own community, they want somebody covering the school board meeting, they want somebody covering the city council meeting, and that stuff doesn't exist anymore because of this breakdown in the economic model. So,
And it is something that could happen on a state level. I mean,
Totally.
every state would be.
and it has California and some other states that
Yeah,
passed
Michigan, you got a pretty chill situation here.
modest funding things. So.
You got 2 return customers.
You already started talking a little bit about that, but could you tell us a little bit more about your working conditions? Like, what is it like him to be a freelancer? I'm the brother of freelance journalist myself, so I know a little bit how that works in a German context, but I was curious about that. And seeing Hamilton at the Indies Times magazine, like the project like that. I think one of the issues when we talk about the media landscape and is also scale, right? And that bigger publications like the New York Times, for example, they're able to throw out their content for free or for very small subscriptions if you want, full stop, everything, you want to do the crossword module and all these things, right? And people get used to that, or on the left, they gotten used to free content. And then if you ask them even for meager subscriptions, right, 20 bucks a year or whatever, a lot of people are like, no, I'm not gonna, I don't want to pay for that. But I think we need to invest in our own media infrastructure. I'm with you on, and we need to build our own stuff, but it's not free. It can't be free, right? Unfortunately, right? I mean, it would be wonderful, but how do we bring back some of that mindset too of like, hey, solidarity also means to pay for stuff, like to pay people to do the good reporting so that we are not getting all the crap and we get flooded with the crap, right? And the good stuff is lost.
With the reader funded publication.
Yeah, I have my own publication, and the way I do it is like it's free, and I just ask people to become paid subscribers instead of having a paywall. And that's working for me, but it's working still at like less than 10% of subscribers will pay. So you have to get a lot of subscribers to get enough to support yourself. And it's partly I don't blame people because again, like we've had 100 years when it was free because it was supported by ads. So people got used to the idea that you can get a New York Times for a quarter. And all the millions of dollars that it took to produce that were paid by advertisers. Now that model is gone, we do have to kind of put into people's minds like, yes, you're going to have to pay for this, and all of us, it's fucking tiring, honestly, because if you're a journalist, you want to write stuff, and you don't want to every time you write something then have to do this song and dance of like, please pay me, I'm a good guy, and which we kind of find ourselves having to do a lot. But yeah, I mean, hopefully over time that the idea that, look, just, I just tell people like, just pay for what, if you like something, pay for it. Like whether it's your local newspaper, whether it's a website you read, a journalist you like just try to get in the habit of understanding that stuff we don't pay for is going to go away. And that's the reality. But I do think it's going to take time. What do you think?
Well, I'm more of like a straight up freelancer. Like I have a couple of newsletters, but I don't put that much work into it. I'm not, Hamilton's like a machine. You should all subscribe. But honestly, the way that my life and career, job, whatever works as a freelancer is I've made a lot of very tactical decisions. Like I don't live in New York anymore. I live in Philly, pretty cheap city. I live with my partner. We don't have kids. We don't have pets. We don't have a car. Those are things that if I had more money or a more stable job, like maybe some of those things would shift, but they can't because this is what I want to do. And I have a couple regular places I contribute, like in these times, We Love, The Nation, Teen Vogue. And it works out enough economically with that, living a very frugal existence, getting to do cool things like this once in a while. Like I can make it work as long as nothing changes. Like for example, since they are getting rid of all those healthcare subsidies that we had, I don't know if I'm gonna have health insurance next year. Maybe not. Cross fingers for your girl. So like that's kind of the reality of freelancing. Either maybe you come from a fancier family than mine and things work out a little nicer, or you figure out how to hustle and prioritize and pick your battles. And I'm okay with that because the work I do is really important to me and I think that there's value to it. But there are much easier jobs to go for, I would say. And yeah, that's just my particular situation as an individual. But there are a lot of people in that position. And the amount of media outlets that have budgets and have editors who are willing to listen to us and give us a little bit of money to write, those are dwindling. Like Hamilton said, it's all kind of contracting. And I could be the best writer in the world, the best admin person, because so much admin, chasing down $400 for 3 months. It's delightful. But none of it, it doesn't matter if I'm the perfect like Terminator style freelancer if there's nowhere to write. So that's something that's always in the back of mind too, just because I'm kind of in a specific niche. And there's only so many places that are interested in what I have to say. So it's a little tough, but you know, what else am I gonna do?
Mhm.
Here, I think we have time for maybe one more quickie question, right? Y'all wanna fight?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll be hanging out after.
I don't know quickie, but, or it can be answered, but, the labor movement and people are always like gonna disagree about the heart of the problem, whether you would call it problem capitalism, whether you call it unfettered greed, or the regulations that exist are strong enough or not. But in times of such like nihilism, it seems like, I don't know if it's necessarily historically true, but a path is nihilism and a path is, radicalization. And so I feel like the labor movement will have to decide about like what its approach will be, but class consciousness is going to require, you know, people coming in from that aren't union, because union density is so low. And so I guess my question is, do you have any thoughts about the way that coverage should operate because of this just like absolute onslaught and all these fears? Whether it's just like making these union battles like so personal that you understand the direct effect and like, no, it's not a perfect solution, but it's chipping away towards something better. Do you think that's the answer in this context?
I think, you're right that to me, like, we've had this crisis of inequality going on for so long, and it was like, socialism and the fascism, like the angel and the devil on each shoulder. Because eventually you have to go kind of one way or the other if you don't fix the underlying problem. And the labor movement is inherently tied to that, right? So I think the parts of the labor movement that don't see themselves as radical, which is probably the majority of it, if you ask people, are going to find themselves pushed to radicalism because of the reality of the situation that we're in and the level of attacks on labor that are going on right now. Labor is going to have to either get radical or die, I think. And, the coverage has to reflect that.
Yeah, and unions have so much potential to be engines of political education. And I think not every union, but a decent amount of them, from internationals down to locals, there are leaders that have maybe been in power for a long time, that were elected a bunch of years ago, that perhaps aren't keeping up with the political reality of the moment. I mean, we've seen these big reform moments sweep the UAW, the Teamsters, which kind of worked. Like there's efforts happening with UFW, et cetera. I think we're kind of gonna have to get rid of some dead wood and get new leadership in from the rank and file that reflects the urgency of the moment. And not for nothing, I am involved in like various radical things at home, and union folks do show up. They're not necessarily repping their union, but there are people in unions that are, primed and ready to get active, to get radical, whatever. If they're not finding in their union, they're finding it somewhere else. So at the very least, we can hold hope in those people and know that unions and labor is not a monolith. Like on one side, we might have the people that are cozying up to Trump, and then the other side, we have the people that are getting arrested at ICE protests. And as long as we can increase the numbers on this side and decrease ones on those, however that happens, whether it's through smart reporting or political education, or I don't know, like coalitions between local educators and organizers and smart people in general, I feel like there's so much potential. We just need to do it. And really ensure that whoever's in charge understands that this isn't a fucking game. We have 1 minute left, so I think that might be our time.
So why don't we give a round of applause for. About a half an hour break.